Welcome back. If you're trying to stay on top of crucial global events, especially in defense and security, and I know many of you listening are, perhaps even for UPSC prep, today's deep dive is definitely for you.
Absolutely. We're zeroing in on the performance of those Western main battle tanks in Ukraine. The German Leopard 2s and the U.S. Abrams. There's been a lot of talk.
There really has, and we're going to unpack that mainly looking at a report from the Eurasian Times. It brings together claims from Russia's Rostec, data from Oryx, the open source guys, and other media bits.
Yeah, so our mission here, if you like, is to sift through these different takes. Rostec's view versus the visual evidence versus the initial hype.
Exactly. To get you a more nuanced picture of how effective these tanks have actually been and what's influencing that on the ground, it's about getting past the headlines. Vital context, really.
Okay, so let's kick off with what Rostec, the Russian defense giant, is saying. They've come out quite strongly, claiming the German Leopard 2s are, well, much inferior to their own tanks.
Which tanks are they comparing them to specifically?
They mentioned the T-72B3M, the T-80BVM, and their more modern T-90M, pretty much their main frontline tanks.
And this isn't just talk, right? They claim they've actually examined one.
That's right. They say this is based on evaluating a captured Leopard 2A6. And their reasoning. They argue Russian tanks just have better all-around protection.
Protection against what, though? What are the key threats they're highlighting?
Mostly drones and anti-tank missile systems. They talk about having things like counterheat screens and better reactive armor fits, basically layers designed to stop modern anti-tank weapons.
It's all about survivability in this new kind of warfare, I suppose.
Exactly, and they don't stop there. Rostec also takes a swipe at the older Leopard ones that Ukraine is using, calling them largely inefficient now.
So they're painting a picture of Russian technical superiority here, and they've been quite public about it.
Oh, very. Displaying captured tanks as war trophies. There's one Leopard 2, reportedly an A6, even in a museum in St. Petersburg. It's very deliberate messaging.
Now, we have to add a big caveat here, don't we? For you listening, Western experts are pretty skeptical.
Extremely skeptical. Many see these Rostec claims largely as propaganda, part of the information war. You even had one Russian military commentator calling the Leopards German trash.
Strong words. But on the other hand, the Eurasian Times report does talk about a debacle for the Leopard 2, so maybe the reality is somewhere in the middle. It hasn't lived up to the hype.
It certainly seems that way. The initial high expectations haven't quite matched the battlefield performance, regardless of the Russian commentary.
Let's look at some numbers then. Oryx, the open source intelligence group, they track visually confirmed losses. What does their data show for Leopard 2s?
It's quite significant. Based only on visual evidence, photos, videos, they list 18 Leopard 2A5s, 26 of the older 2A4s, and 13 Leopard 2A6s as lost by Ukraine.
And Oryx themselves say the real number could be higher, right? Because not every loss gets filmed.
Precisely. And remember the context. These tanks were billed as potential game changers. Advanced armor, great fire control, that powerful 120mm gun. We're talking the 2A4, 2A6, even the Swedish Stridsvagn 122 version.
I remember that. Initially, when we saw those first losses during the counteroffensive, the narrative was often about, well, poor strategy, wasn't it? Not necessarily the tank itself.
It was, yeah. But as things have gone on, it's clear the tanks are facing some really tough challenges. Russian anti-tank guided missiles, the Cornet, for example, precision artillery.
And drones. We keep hearing about drones.
Absolutely. Especially those first-person view, FPV, drones. They're cheap, precise, and they're being used to devastating effect.
Have they exposed specific weaknesses in the Leopard?
Well, the report highlights that, like many tanks, the Leopard's side and rear armor isn't as thick as the front. So hits from ATGMs or even older RPGs from the side or back can be a problem.
Frontal armor is usually the strongest, and that makes sense. What about defensive systems? Did the Ukrainian Leopards have things like active protection systems, APS?
Initially, it seems most didn't. APS are systems that try to shoot down incoming missiles. But there's been some social media footage suggesting Ukraine has started fitting some Leopards with the Israeli Trophy APS.
Okay, so maybe adapting. But those FPV drones and loitering munitions seem particularly tricky.
They really are. They can target the weaker top armor or hit the sides. The report mentions losses of Leopard 2A6s, specifically from side hits by drones and ATGMs. You see those add-on cope cages on top now? That's a direct response.
A very visible sign of the threat. But we need to be balanced here. It's not just Western tanks taking hits, is it?
Not at all. Russian tanks are also suffering heavy losses. Their armor, even with steel, composites, and ERA, isn't invincible. Far from it.
Does Oryx have numbers for Russian losses too?
They do, and they're substantial. We're talking estimates of roughly 200 to 300 T-72B3Ms, about 142 T-80BVMs, and around 130 of the more modern T-90Ms visually confirmed as lost.
So significant losses on both sides, and presumably drones are a big factor in the Russian losses too.
Definitely. Evolving drone tactics, kamikaze drones, those FPV drones. Again, Ukraine has gotten very adept at using them against Russian armor. It's a two-way street, this technological adaptation.
Is there anything about the Leopard 2 design that's proving advantageous, despite the vulnerabilities?
One key thing mentioned is crew survivability. The Leopard stores its main gun ammo in the turret bustle, behind armored doors, with blowout panels on top.
Blowout panels, what do they do?
If the ammo gets hit and explodes, the panels are designed to blow upwards, directing the blast away from the crew inside the turret. It doesn't always save the tank, but it significantly increases the crew's chances of survival compared to, say, older Russian designs where ammo detonation often obliterated the whole tank.
That's a critical difference.
Yeah.
Interesting, though, that despite this feature, Russian state media has been hammering the weak armor narrative since early 2023.
It seems like a consistent message, yeah, part of that broader information campaign we mentioned.
There was even that claim from a Russian intelligence veteran, Kondrashov, saying they knew the weak spots.
Yes. He apparently told RIA Novosti they had advanced intelligence on Leopard vulnerabilities, knew where and how to shoot. But again, no official confirmation from the Russian moiety on that, so take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. There's another major Western tank in the mix, the American Abrams.
Right, the M1 Abrams. Ukraine was set to get quite a few, over 40 from Australia, plus the 31 the U.S. sent directly.
Let's talk about the Australian ones first. 49 M1A1s. That was announced back in October 2024, but then there were delays.
Yeah, reports mentioned unidentified obstacles and technological limitations. Sounded a bit vague, but it held things up.
But they're moving now.
Seems so. ABC News reported recently that the first batch is being loaded onto a ship. Obviously, for security, they're not saying where or when it'll arrive. President Zelensky publicly thanked Australia for them.
Transferring U.S.-made equipment always needs U.S. approval, right? It's that smooth.
It got approved, yes. But the report suggests some, let's say, private frustration from U.S. officials about sending these older, decommissioned tanks, maybe concerns about how they'd actually fare.
Echoing some warnings we heard earlier.
Exactly. A U.S. official apparently warned it would be complicated and difficult to sustain the Abrams for Ukraine. That hints at logistical challenges, maintenance, maybe even performance concerns in this specific war zone.
And Ukraine already had those 31 Abrams from the U.S. delivered by October 2023. What's been the experience with those? Hopes were high initially.
They were. But that initial optimism seems to have faded quite a bit. The drone and missile threat is just so intense.
So similar issues to the Leopards.
Pretty much, yes. The report mentions Ukrainian crews talking to the media back in May 2024, saying they felt exposed because the armor wasn't sufficient against, quote, modern weapons like drones.
Were there technical problems too?
Apparently so. Things like condensation affecting the electronics were mentioned by crews. Just generally, the crews felt the Abrams were ill-suited for the conditions in Ukraine.
And Russia has captured some Abrams, too.
Yes, just like the Leopards. At least one captured Abrams has been put on display as a war trophy alongside a Leopard. It feeds that Russian narrative.
And the Australian tanks being sent, they're older M1A1s, right? Because Australia is upgrading.
That's the context. Australia is moving to the more modern M1A2 Abrams. So these M1A1s being sent are older models. The report suggests they'll likely need refurbishment, or some might even just be used for spare parts by Ukraine.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it's a really complex picture, isn't it?
It really is. You've got Rostec claiming Leopard inferiority. You've got visually confirmed losses for both Leopards and Abrams. You've got crews reporting vulnerabilities. And hanging over all of it is this drone warfare revolution.
It really changes the calculus for armored warfare. For those of you tracking international security, perhaps through UPSC, these are the kinds of shifts you need to understand. The interplay of tech, tactics, and the harsh realities of the modern battlefield.
And just to reiterate, most of what we've discussed comes from that Eurasian Times report, which itself relies on sources like Rostec and Oryx. Independent verification in a war zone is always tricky.
Definitely. So it leaves us and you with a big question to think about. Given all this, what is the future of the main battle tank?
How do military doctrines adapt? How does technology respond? Think about the FPV drone threat. How do you counter something like that effectively on a large scale? What does this mean for defense spending and strategy globally?
Lots to chew on there. We hope this deep dive, drawing from the Eurasian Times, has given you a clearer, more detailed perspective on these tanks in Ukraine.
If you found this breakdown useful, whether for study or just staying informed, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already.
And definitely leave a comment below. Let us know your thoughts, or if you have any other questions sparked by today's discussion. Thanks for joining us.